Thanks, Anthony. Predator pigs, canines, sugar daddies. You find the best stories. That's our top stories on Law and Crime. You can go learn a little bit more about that and a little bit more about some legal stories in the news today on lawandcrime.com. But let's focus on our main trial of the day, our live trial of the program. This is a case, as I said, that seems like it was taken straight out of a movie. It is the case of Reverend Shaun Harrison out of Massachusetts. A reverend named Shaun Harrison is on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high school student by shooting him execution style in the back of the head in 2015. I'm not making this up. I'm also not making up the theory that the prosecution is going with, that Mr. Harrison is really leading a double life as a drug dealer. We have a short report about this case, a summary that can explain what has happened and where we're going in this live trial. Take a look. Thanks again, Anthony. So that is a report on our top case of the day. This is the one we are going to be live in, this really bizarre case of a reverend on trial. But let's learn a little bit more about it with my very special guest. Joining me in studio is criminal defense attorney Linda Kenney Baden. Linda, it's great to have you.
Back, Jesse, I'm back.
I'm glad you're back because we listened to this case about a reverend who was working in a school being accused of operating a double life as a drug dealer, going around shooting students that he enlisted to sell drugs for him. What have we learned so far? Now, this is day 4 in the case. What have we learned so far that would say, you know what? There's credibility to these claims. What have we learned in court so far?
Well, when they raided or did a search warrant on the Reverend's apartment, because he said himself, he's not a killer, he's the Rev, they found guns.
Which, by the way, I love. I love that statement.
It's a great line if this were a movie. Unfortunately, this is this poor kid's real life, you know. But they found guns and they found a large stack of marijuana. We don't know how much right now because it hasn't been identified. But that would indicate that, indeed, he is a drug dealer. He's playing with guns. You know, in this day and age that we want to keep guns out of the bad guys getting into school. Turns out the bad guy is a teacher here and a reverend to boot. I mean, the top trust you could have, right? And
I mean, we can't forget the fact, and we showed it in our short report, the victim himself, Luis Rodriguez, testified and said, you mentioned it to me before we came on, right, the power of positively identifying your attacker in the courtroom. That really resonates with the jury.
When you've had a prior identification from his hospital bed that Harrison shot him, he said, what did I do to deserve this? And then when he went like this and he pointed, I mean, we have a history of cases in the United States. It started back from the Lindbergh kidnapping ages and ages ago, you know, almost a century ago now, when the Lindbergh, the pilot, pointed to Mr. Houghton, the person who was found guilty later on, and said, he's the one who I saw that night who kidnapped my baby, and I saw him in the cemetery. So that's powerful identification, direct.
And the victim survived. So we always cover cases here where we don't have the ability to ask the victim, who did this to you? Here we do. Now again, Mr. Harrison, Reverend Harrison, I should say, Pastor Harrison, has said he's not guilty, that this is all a fabrication. And that's really up to the jury. Do they believe Luis Rodriguez, who has admitted that he has dealt drugs in the past? And do they believe these other witnesses? And that's what I want to talk about right now. As we wait for the live feed, it's always good to have corroborating testimony. So who did we see? We saw the testimony of a man named Kevin Perez, who says that Harrison, the defendant, enlisted him into the illicit drug trade. And not only that, listen to what he said about asking him to attack the victim. Let's take a look. That was some important testimony right there in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case here that we're covering on Law and Crime and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. So that was the testimony of Kevin Perez. What are we talking about here? We're talking about Reverend Shaun Harrison, a Boston pastor that is currently on trial. We're covering it here. We're waiting for our live feed. He's currently on trial for numerous crimes in connection with attempting to murder, or I should say allegedly attempting to murder, a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. And why would someone do knew this? Well, Mr. Harrison was the dean of the school, and according to the one of the deans in the school, and he said that the allegation by the prosecution is that he enlisted the help of students to help him sell drugs, that he was leading a double life, first as a pastor and a reverend and a dean, and then on the other way as a drug dealer. And there was a dispute between Mr. Rodriguez and Harrison where I think it was over decreased drug sales, decreased marijuana sales, and he wanted to kill him. Who you just heard was Kevin Perez. That is a second student who's now come forward and said the Rev wanted me to sell drugs for him, and not only that, he wanted me to attack the victim. Let's talk a little bit more about it with Kenney Baden. Okay, so if we take this as true, what he said, what the victim has said earlier in the case, how is it that this reverend could get into the school system and operate a criminal enterprise in there? We talk about so much today, rapists in school, you know,
sexual molesters,
all these kinds of things. How is this happening?
Well, it could happen in two ways. One, he's very good at leading a double life because he's big in the community. He goes around, he talks about we need religion in school. He ingratiates himself. So you wouldn't think that he's going to be a drug dealer, kind of like the mafia, like the Sopranos, like the Goodfellas, you know? You wouldn't think that of him. But it turns out, if you believe what these people are saying, these young men are saying, it's true, he does. And he can do it because he does it by taking at-risk students. What do I mean by that? Students who've had problems. For instance, Rodriguez, his mother was in jail. He's being raised by his grandmother. He's a kid who wanted a mentor, so he looked to the Rev as being a mentor. So, you know, they engaged his trust. He engaged his trust, just like pedophiles do with young students in school. They get their trust, and then once they have their trust, they ask them to commit a crime.
Do you believe them? Do you believe these two students who came forward and said that the Reverend is really a drug dealer and an attempted murderer?
If I'm sitting out there in that jury room right now, I believe these two young men. Now, whether or not he ordered one of them to kill Rodriguez or just rough him up a little bit or fight him, as they said, I don't know. I haven't gotten that far yet. But I absolutely do believe that he is a drug dealer.
Well, there's a lot to dissect in this bizarre case out of Massachusetts. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we might have the live feed in that courtroom. If not, there's so much more to talk about in the Shaun Harrison case. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. Thanks for joining us. We have a very, very exciting case for you. We're waiting for the live feed. I'm looking at the courtroom feed right now. I don't see it starting just yet, but as soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the Shaun Harrison case, the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Now, I could explain it to you, but you know what? We have a great report from our very own Anthony Velez, who can explain what has happened so far in this case. Take a look.
The trial of a popular street pastor from Boston, who authorities claim lived a double life running a drug dealing ring, will resume this week. 58-year-old Reverend Shaun Harrison allegedly shot Luis Rodriguez in the back of the head in 2015.
Who shot you in the back of the head?
Mr. Shaun Harrison did.
Authorities reportedly have obtained surveillance camera footage that shows Harrison shooting Rodriguez. Luckily, Rodriguez, who was 17 years old at the time, survived the shooting. Harrison was mentoring Rodriguez before he recruited him to sell marijuana and allegedly shot him after a dispute. Upon searching his home, investigators found guns, ammunition, and large bags of marijuana. Rodriguez testified last week on the second day of trial, detailing how in a span of a month, he went from being mentored by Harrison to selling weed for him to being shot by him execution style. Prosecutors alleged Harrison shot Rodriguez due to his slumping drug sales. On cross-examination, defense attorney Bruce Carroll pressed Rodriguez on his prior history with drug sales and why he didn't immediately identify Harrison as the shooter. Harrison faces several counts, including armed assault to murder and illegal possession of drugs, firearms, and ammunition. I'm Anthony Velez for Law and Crime.
That's the Reverend Shaun Harrison case that we're covering here on Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. You don't want to miss it. We're waiting for the live feed in that courtroom. It should be noted the reason the feed hasn't started just yet is because one of the jurors is running late. Shame on that juror. Come on, we have to show our audience what's happening here in this really bizarre case of attempted murder. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney Kenney Baden. I think one of the interesting things about this case is trying to understand what the defense is, right? So you have this reverend who the prosecution is saying was leading a double life. As you said earlier on in the program, they raided his house. They found guns, ammunition, bags of marijuana. They have at least 2 students who have now come forward and said that he tried to enlist them to sell drugs for him. One of those students is the victim who says that Harrison shot him in the head. There's a lot of evidence right now against him.
Right.
But what's the defense's best strategy?
Well, the best strategy for the defense is that these are kids, really. I mean, they're not going to be specific on a lot of things. The other young man who talked about Harrison also being a drug dealer, he's not going to be, from what I could see, very detailed on these conversations.
Kevin Perez.
Kevin Perez. As a matter of fact, it reminds me of like kids that are sexually abused. The abuser picks out kids that have problems, that are at risk, and then when it comes time to go to the police or talk to the police, those same kids have issues talking to the police because they are at risk. So I think it's very clever that he actually uses the position of power, if it is true, if he's guilty, to pick out these kids who are going to be tough sells to a jury in terms of how they identify conversations and specifics.
And in terms of credibility, and the defense has grilled these 2 students under cross-examination. In fact, the victim, and we showed it in our short report, the victim, Luis Rodriguez, he was questioned under cross-examination. Why didn't you first identify Mr. Harrison? Now, he's come back and said, look, I got shot in the head. I had to make sense of what was happening. And that's a fair statement.
Right. That is a fair statement. And he's a kid. He's not someone that we had, for instance, in our case in Hernandez, where it was a really bad guy, who didn't identify. But the other thing is interesting that the prosecution has. They have this video of the shooting, right?
What did you think of that shooting?
I don't know why they can't try to indicate by using some kind of measurements about how big was the person, how tall was the person who did the shooting compared to Rodriguez, because they know Rodriguez's height. So I'm surprised about that.
For all of our listeners on SiriusXM Radio, the video that was captured of this shooting, it's very hard to determine who is who. It's very hard to determine if, in fact, the shooter was Harrison. It looks like a shooting took place. It looks like 2 men, and it looks like one was running off. Could be Harrison, could be not. It really depends upon how the jury views that video. What I want to do right now is we wait for the live feed, and Linda and I were talking a little bit about it. Kevin Perez is another student in the school. Remember, Mr. Harrison, Reverend Harrison, was one of the deans in the school. And Kevin Perez came forward, testified, said, Harrison enlisted me to sell drugs too. He even wanted me to attack the victim in this case. I want to talk more about that right now. This is when he testified and explained a little bit more about when Luis Rodriguez, the victim, the person that was allegedly shot by the defendant, was attacked in school. Let's learn a little bit more about that. And was Mr. Harrison the person who gave the order? Take a look. All right, everybody, welcome back to Law&Crime and Law&Crime on SiriusXM Radio. Speaking of SiriusXM Radio, for all of our listeners, what the viewers were watching, hopefully you can come back and look, was a surveillance footage, some key surveillance footage in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. So we're talking about Reverend Shaun Harrison. He's currently on trial. He's on trial for attempting to murder a high school student. He was the dean, one of the deans at the school. And the reason the prosecution has said that he tried to kill this student was because Mr. Harrison was operating in the drug trade, and he enlisted the help of Mr. Rodriguez as one of his sales associates to sell marijuana. There was a dispute about decreasing marijuana sales, and he wanted him taken out. Now, what did we just see in that video? Well, Mr. Rodriguez was in school one day. He's walking down the hall, and all of a sudden, bam, he gets hit by a student right through a door, literally tackled right through the door. It looks almost like he's unconscious. And why is that important? Because it's alleged that Mr. Harrison hired or enlisted the help of another student to attack Rodriguez. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney Linda Kenney Baden. If this is true, not only is this twisted, this sounds like you said earlier, it's like the mafia. It's trying to use students as soldiers to take out a person.
Right. As a matter of fact, Kevin Perez said that the other person that was in the room with Harrison trying to enlist the help to attack Luis Rodriguez was a guy named Laudy, and that's apparently Laudy that is pushing Luis Rodriguez through that door pretty strongly, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, forget the viewers. I mean, let's not forget the viewers. But when the jury, who ultimately makes the decision, sees this. How do they make sense of that?
Well, they're going to either say, yes, this is corroborative of the fact that Harrison was enlisting these people to help them take out Luis, or they're going to say, well, maybe this is defense-oriented. Maybe this is Laude and Kevin Perez had a beef with Luis Rodriguez, and they're the ones now putting the blame on Reverend Harrison. So it can go two ways depending on what the other evidence is.
Because you look at the video, you see somebody tackling the victim. You don't really know why that happened. It's so easy to say someone ordered me to do that. So what is the evidence of that order, right? That's the question.
That's the question.
And really,
That's
isn't that tough? I mean, the only evidence you have is as a witness saying, the defendant told me to do that.
Right.
Without any there's no email evidence, there's nothing like that.
And the reason why the defense can utilize this, I'm not going to say successful, but they can utilize it, is because, then it's a motive. Then there's a motive to put it on Harrison from Laude and
Right.
Kevin. And Luis Rodriguez could still be very scared of these two, Laude and Kevin, if they attacked them on their own, and then he would dime out somebody else, not them.
Really interesting. And we're watching that video once more. Crazy this is happening right in a high school. We have some more testimony right now to play you of Kevin Perez. Again, this is another student who says that Mr. Harrison, the defendant, the Reverend, the Rev, hired him not only to be one of his drug associates, but to take out Luis Rodriguez, the victim, to hurt him. So let's learn a little bit more from Kevin Perez, who became a crucial witness in this case. Let's learn a little bit about what he saw and what he heard in connection with this case. Welcome back, everybody. This is Jesse Weber here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. We're playing you some testimony right there of Kevin Perez in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a case that we're waiting for the live feed in that courtroom. One of the jurors is late. Reverend Shaun Harrison is a Boston pastor who's currently on trial for attempting to murder a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Harrison was one of the deans in the school, and it's alleged that he enlisted Mr. Rodriguez as one of his sales associates in the drug trade to sell marijuana. It was accused that Mr. Harrison's leading a double life, and that there was a dispute over decreased drug sales, and he tried to kill him one night by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style. Mr. Rodriguez survived that shooting, and took the stand last week talking about how Harrison tried to kill him. What we saw in Kevin Perez is another student who said that Harrison enlisted him in the drug trade and also enlisted him to try to take out Mr. Rodriguez. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney Linda Kenney Baden, excuse me. What did we learn from that clip about this guy? What was going on there?
I know, it was very confusing. Now, Kevin Perez, in that clip, obviously corroborated the story that the Reverend, or the Rev as he likes to be called, does have a lot of marijuana at his house, if you believe him, that he had a lot of marijuana and all. But when he asked about weapons at his house, I think what the prosecution was looking for was guns, to corroborate the fact that he had guns that could have been used in the crime. And all he got is that he had a knife. He had a big knife, and I'm sure it was, but there wasn't a knife used in this crime against Luis Rodriguez. So I don't know how much that advanced the prosecution's case.
But guns and ammo were found in Harrison's apartment. You know, we look at Harrison, you read about, try to understand a little bit more about how are we where we are today. Did you know, and I don't know if our viewers know or our listeners know, that the day of, or maybe even the day before this shooting took place, Harrison was supposed to be fired for allegedly shoving a female student. So you listen to this, and you're listening to the background of him, and I did some research, our team did some research on him. He also had a son who was allegedly molested by a clergyman, and you're gaining a little bit of a dark history into this seemingly good reverend.
Yeah, and I also thought that, didn't he have a child who shot his lover or his wife in the head or something like that?
I'm not sure I heard that, but maybe.
I heard something, but whatever it is, you have this unseemly halo, if you want to call it, because it's not really a halo, it's a reverse halo, around the Rev here that makes you think that he could do these things. You certainly believe that he could sell the marijuana. You certainly believe that he had weapons. The question is, did he order a hit?
And that's really the question, and the most important thing that the defense wants to say is, this is not true, that our client is completely innocent. This was an anti-gun activist. This was a reverend. He wanted to help people. He didn't want to hurt people. So when Mr. Perez, the person who you hear about on these in this examination room, in the courtroom, saying that Harrison is the one that hired him, he was involved in the drug trade, he was a killer, all this stuff, when he had the opportunity to be cross-examined by the defense, You can just imagine how much they grilled him, how much they questioned him about what he did in fact see, what did he hear, and really poking holes in his testimony and telling the jury, do not believe this man. Well, let's learn a little bit more about it when the defense cross-examined this key witness in this case. Take a look. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. You were just listening to some really important testimony in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Again, this is about that Boston pastor who's on trial for attempted murder. It's alleged that he tried to kill a high school student named Luis Rodriguez over the drug trade, that he was actually a drug dealer leading a double life, hired Rodriguez to sell weed for him. They had a dispute, tried to kill him by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style. But Rodriguez luckily survived this alleged shooting attempt. So what did we just hear? We heard from Kevin Perez, who was another student in this high school. Reverend Shaun Harrison was one of the deans in the school, apparently ran the after-school program. Kevin Perez says that Harrison tried to enlist him, too, in the drug trade, and not only that, wanted him to take out or attack or injure the victim here, Luis Rodriguez. But now, what you were just listening to was Kevin Perez under cross-examination, and the defense is poking some interesting holes. Let's bring back in Kenney Baden, criminal defense attorney. I thought that was really interesting. They said to him, you were smoking weed at that time, you were missing school. Even if you look at his demeanor, now I know our listeners on Sirius XM Radio can't see it, but he's smiling. The witness is smiling a little bit. I mean, what did you make of that entire back and forth between him and the defense counsel?
Well, it could go both ways. You know, he was smirking a little bit. I mean, he wasn't sure about specifics. But then by the same token, the defense attorney was asking things like, well, how does staying after school help you make up your grades? And he says, well, could you make up the work? So, I mean, you're having a generational issue here, I think, on the cross-examination more than anything else. So, yes, he can't talk about specifics on some things, but he can talk about specifics about the marijuana. So we know that the Reverend's not going to take the person that's going to be a priest. I mean, that's not a good example these days. He's not going to take the person that's going to be a brain surgeon to go sell marijuana. He's going to take kids like this. So his demeanor didn't bother me.
Now, the idea that he doesn't remember certain things that he originally said or testified to, and when you have those inconsistent statements, how much of it is, okay, this event happened 3 years ago, and how much of it is, I'm making this up now, maybe because I want to do well on the jury, I want to do well on the witness stand, or I'm filling my mind with certain things I read in the news. You're a defense attorney. What is that danger like?
Well, so here's the dichotomy here. So one, he can't remember stuff because he says it's 3 years ago. So you were making it up. You can't remember it because it didn't happen. Or you can say, well, he's really truthful, isn't he? Because he's not elaborating right now and trying to fill in the blanks. He's telling you, I can't remember because it happened 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So, you've got to be real careful as a defense attorney. Which side are you going to choose here about him not telling, not remembering things?
And it's really not up to us, is it, Linda? It's really up to that jury, the fact finder. They have to look at each witness and determine, is this person credible or not? Now, we have a live feed in that courtroom. Nothing has happened yet. We do have a feed. We're looking for all of our listeners. We see the defendant. He's there. He's talking with his counsel. The trial hasn't started yet. The jury hasn't been called in. I'm carefully looking at the feed. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, hopefully we'll have a live feed in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. We are covering the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. This is about a Boston pastor who's on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high school student named Luis Rodriguez by shooting him execution style in the back of the head in 2015. And the motive? That he was really leading a double life as a drug dealer, enlisted Rodriguez as one of his drug dealing associates. They had a dispute, and he tried to kill him. We have a live feed in that courtroom right now, and it appears that the witness we've been talking about earlier on the program, Kevin Perez, the other student who says that Harrison tried to get him to be involved in the drug trade and also try to help him to take out Mr. Rodriguez, the victim, is back on the stand. Let's listen in live. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. We are covering a really interesting case out of Massachusetts. This is about a reverend named Shaun Harrison who's on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high schooler by shooting him execution style in the back of the head back in 2015. According to Luis Rodriguez, the victim, Mr. Harrison, who was the dean or was one of the deans in the high school, befriended him and brought him into the illicit world of the drug trade. He was selling marijuana for him, allegedly. The prosecution argues that Reverend Harrison lured Rodriguez out one night and shot him due to decreased weed sales. On the stand right now is Kevin Perez, another student in the high school, who has testified earlier in this case and testified today that the Reverend is not what he claims to be. The Reverend says he's not guilty, that he's not a drug dealer, he's not a gang member. Well, this witness right now is saying different. He's saying, I've seen Mr. Harrison with marijuana in the school. I've seen him pass it to people. He had a knife in his office. And guess what? He asked me to be part of the drug trade, and he asked me to take out the victim, to actually attack the victim. He's under cross-examination right now. Let's go live.
That's
Okay, some really interesting testimony right there that you were listening to and watching here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. That was Kevin Perez testifying in the Shaun Harrison case. This is Shaun Harrison, a reverend who's on trial for allegedly attempting to murder a high school student named Luis Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison is actually a drug dealer that enlisted students to help him sell marijuana. Mr. Rodriguez was one of his sales associates, got into a dispute with him about decreased drug sales and tried to shoot him. Kevin Perez, who was just on the stand, is one of those students that was, I guess, a part of this operation or was trying to be enlisted by Mr. Harrison. And there's an interesting back and forth right there about when did he say, when did Mr. Harrison say he was going to shoot Luis? Did he try to ask you to shoot Luis? Let's talk a little bit more about it here with Kenney Baden, criminal defense attorney. It's not even entirely clear from that back and forth because what we just learned, the testimony of Mr. Perez earlier in this case now seems to be very inconsistent. What did you make of it?
Well, I was getting confused too, and I was looking for consistency. Like a juror, I'm sitting here. How does this help the prosecution's case? And yet now he's talking about, well, I don't know who was there, and then he says there was another person there besides Loudy, and then one time he says he doesn't remember when the Reverend told him to shoot Lewis, and then all of a sudden he does remember it's in this conversation. And then the one thing I came away with is, if you're the Reverend, are you going to sit there and tell two other troubled kids or three other troubled children that you're using as marijuana mules, and he asked them to say, well, I'm going to go shoot Lewis? That didn't ring true to me, and I think that had some problems with it. So I think the jury may be looking to Kevin Perez for some corroboration on the marijuana sales, but maybe it didn't help the prosecution so much on whether or not the Reverend was going to shoot Lewis.
So what in other words, because Mr. Harrison is charged with numerous crimes.
Right.
He's charged with gun charges, drug charges, attempted murder. It's a specific language in the Massachusetts statute for that. But the point is you're saying he made a stronger case, Mr. Perez, under his testimony, that, you know what, it looked like Mr. Harrison had weed in his office. He was selling weed. He was involved in the drug trade. But it's not entirely clear that he either asked somebody to kill Luis or he said he was going to kill Luis. Let's go back live. The judge is speaking right now. This, again, is the Shaun Harrison case. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber. This is a live feed into the Shaun Harrison case that you're listening and watching to. Again, Shaun Harrison, this reverend, is on trial for attempted murder as well as numerous gun charges and drug charges. What's happening right now is the judge is instructing the jury about their sight view. The jury is going to be able to go to the crime scene. And what's the crime scene here? Well, Mr. Harrison is on trial for allegedly attempting to shoot and kill allegedly attempting to shoot and kill a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It happened in a public place near a gas station. It's alleged that he's tried to shoot him execution style in the back of the head. So why would the jury be allowed to see this, and is there any benefit to it? Let's bring back in Kenney Baden. Linda, is there any benefit to the jury seeing this crime scene, this shooting scene?
Well, you know, I come from a state that I mostly try cases in New Jersey that they don't do views very often. But having been in the Aaron Hernandez case in Massachusetts, we did do a jury view. You can see the area. You can see whether or not it's a high crime area, a low crime area. You can see whether there's lighting overhead, why the video cameras maybe didn't catch faces. So, yeah, it does add some advantage, but I don't know how much advantage it adds to this case. I think the crux of it comes down to Luis Rodriguez's testimony.
Real quick, before we go to our next break, you mentioned something about where the shooting took place.
Right.
It's in the Roxbury area. I'm not familiar with that area in Massachusetts, but can you explain what that's like and how it might relate to this?
And the jury will be. It is a gang-related area. When we did Aaron Hernandez, that was one of the areas that came up as being a possible gang-related area. So the jurors will know that. I didn't know that, obviously, coming into the state. That's why it's so important to have jurors who are familiar with the area on your jury and not bring other people in.
It's really interesting, especially when Mr. Harrison says, I'm not a gang member, I'm not a drug dealer, I'm just the Rev. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Anthony, now I've heard stories before, but a pig following someone, and for all of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, I'm sorry you couldn't see that. They put the pig in the back of the police cruiser. Oh, man, I'm here with Linda Kenney Baden. Linda, that's a different one for me. I haven't seen that before.
I love that story because it's so funny. I mean, we're dealing with crime and murder and attempted murder and shooting, then we have the cops picking up a pig and putting him in the back of a police car. I love it.
Pigs are treated equally, and I guess they commit
animals
the
have
crimes
rights,
as much as anybody
absolutely.
else. All right, everybody, let's switch gears. We can't talk about the pig and the canine and the sugar daddies all day, although it would be fun too. We're going to switch gears because we want to go back into Massachusetts. We are on a break right now in our live feed in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who's facing some serious crimes right now, some serious charges, including gun charges, drug charges, and charges in relation to the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It is alleged that that reverend is not the good old reverend as he claims to be, but is rather leading a double life as a drug dealer, and that he enlisted the help of Mr. Rodriguez to sell marijuana. There was a dispute between the two, allegedly, and what did that result in? It was about decreased marijuana sales. Well, according to the prosecution, Mr. Harrison tried to shoot Rodriguez in the back of the head, execution style, in a public place, right near a gas station. This happened back in 2015. So we're covering this trial right now, and we're learning a lot of interesting things. Linda, one of the interesting things is the jury right now is on a site view. They will be on a site view later in the day about looking where this whole shooting took place. That's interesting to me because you mentioned it in the break. This isn't a murder case.
Right.
Why go to the site view? Is it to show, hey, look, this happened in kind of a remote area, and maybe to show that this was the perfect place for someone to shoot someone?
And maybe the way home for the Reverend is close to his way home and the route they're taking. We don't really know yet because they haven't identified why we're going to site view. I haven't seen it usually except in a murder case. So, it's very expensive. The jurors are all on buses. They're followed by the officers who carry, in Massachusetts, these big, like oar-like things to keep the jury separated. And again, as we talked about, the jurors can't ask questions. They can just take notes on there, and the attorneys can point things out, but they can't ask questions, and they're going to be chomping at the bit to ask questions.
Of course. I mean, it happened really in a public place, and why they need to go when they already saw surveillance footage. Again, for anybody just joining us, this shooting was captured on surveillance footage. It's hard to tell who is doing what. You see two people, it looks like a shooting. You can't tell from the video itself if that is the defendant, but if they believe it is, and you see it happening, I'm not really sure why they would need to see the jury.
This escapes me, but I think we're going to find out, obviously.
Yeah.
Because there has to be a really good reason. Let me put it this way. When judges are going to spend money on a view, they have to have a good reason, because or else, just like everybody else, they're accountable for the cost of the taxpayers, and they won't do it lightly.
That is true. What we're going to do right now as we wait for the feed to come back in the courtroom, I want to play you some crucial testimony. There is a witness in this case that you have to know about. His name is Kevin Perez. He's another student in this high school. Remember, Mr. Harrison was one of the deans in the high school. That's how he met the victim and enlisted him. Well, Kevin Perez says that he, too, knew about Harrison's drug trade, that he knew that he had marijuana in his office. He saw him hand marijuana to people, and he was even enlisted by Mr. Harrison to sell drugs for him, and he was also enlisted by Mr. Harrison to attack Mr. Rodriguez, the victim. So what happened under cross-examination? Well, Mr. Harrison's defense attorneys really wanted to make the point that this guy is making everything up and should not be trusted. This back and forth got very heated. Let's play you some of that testimony. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. That was testimony in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. Let's back up. Reverend Shaun Harrison, a Boston pastor, is currently on trial for many different crimes, gun charges, drug charges, as well as the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Mr. Harrison was one of the deans at the school. And according to the prosecution's theory, Harrison befriended Mr. Rodriguez, brought him into the illicit world of the drug trade because they allege that Mr. Harrison was actually leading a double life as a drug dealer, and after a dispute over drug sales, tried to kill Mr. Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head execution style. The witness that you were just listening to is Kevin Perez, a witness that was currently on the stand earlier today. Kevin Perez is another student at the school. He claims that he knew about Harrison, that he knew that Harrison was a drug dealer and that he had marijuana in his office. He also claims that he was present when Harrison said not only that he was going to shoot Luis Rodriguez, but he tried to get Mr. Perez says that Harrison tried to get him as well as another student named Laudy to try to attack Mr. Rodriguez, kind of like a warning sign, try to intimidate him. Well, there was surveillance footage in the high school, and you see Mr. Rodriguez walking down the hallway when, bam, he gets hit, he gets tackled by this other student named Laudy. Now, this is interesting because Mr. Perez was under cross-examination, and he's really being grilled by the defense attorney about when did you hear these orders being from Mr. Harrison? Where were you? And these lack of details are very interesting to note. And I want to talk about that right now. Joining me via Skype is criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor David DiPietro. David, it's great to have you back here on the program. So this witness, this guy that you hear, sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. I think we were playing a replay right there. So this Kevin Perez character, I want to understand this properly. When you listen to this lack of, I don't know when these orders were sent to me, I don't know where I was, kind of fluid with the details. This was 3 years ago. And if his testimony differed now than what he originally said to the grand jury, how concerned would you be as a juror?
Tying in the greater picture of what was going on. At the end of the day, the victim said he got shot in the back of the head. I mean, that's powerful testimony. I think a lot of this is just laying out the narrative and the timeline. And not everybody is going to remember everything 3 years ago, and not everybody sees everything the same way. The way you see a car accident, I see a car accident at the same time might be different just based upon the way we perceived it, the angle we saw it. So I think that could all be tied up by the prosecution. I don't think it's going to have a detrimental effect on the case.
But the prosecution needs corroborating testimony. They can't just have the victim saying, oh, he shot me, because maybe he's making it up, right? That's obviously the fear. So if you have other students come forward and say, well, I knew Mr. Harrison was selling drugs. He asked me to kill Luis Rodriguez. This is what I don't understand. If you want to talk about common sense and you break it down, would the defendant, I mean, how stupid could someone be if you're sitting in the jury, ask high school students to shoot and kill another high school student and not think that gets back to him? Also, common sense, why would he go out and shoot this person in a public place outside where security cameras could pick him up? So if I'm sitting on the jury and I'm trying to say, common sense, this just doesn't flow to me, what would you say to that?
I would say that it's unbelievable that his actions. It shows how, if I were the prosecutor, show how dangerous he actually is and reckless, and how he didn't really care, and it was part of his intent to premeditated intent to commit murder. But you're right. I mean, they need to corroborate it, so it's not another gunman or another person or whoever. However, the defense is going to try to pick away at the evidence to say it wasn't really him. So it all comes in together. But some of the pieces that were just testified to by Perez, I don't think just listening to it's going to have a actual long-term effect on the outcome of the case.
I'm here also with criminal defense attorney Kenney Baden. Linda, what do you think about that? I saw you laughing a little bit when I was mentioning the common sense aspect.
Yeah,
of it.
I would argue from the defense it's not common sense that somebody is going to tell somebody to shoot a high school student, that I'm going to shoot somebody, that's nonsense. That's what I would say in a summation, because I think if I'm the defense attorney, I'm going here for the conviction for the marijuana. I'm going to try to get the not guilty on the shooting. I mean, that's really where the basket is, right? So I think I would attack, doing everything the defense attorney is now, attacking the fact that this kid can't remember, that Loudy's also a bad person, that these are all druggies, they're all bad people. But is there proof beyond a reasonable doubt that my client shot Luis? I don't know if it's there yet. It may be, but it's not there yet for me.
Well, we'll have to see. They're in a break right now. They might be going on a site view of the crime scene, which we'll talk about as well. But we have to talk about Kevin Perez, this key witness for the prosecution, who's a corroborating witness saying, I saw Harrison with marijuana in the school. I saw him do this. I saw him do this. I saw him and I heard him say that he was going to kill Luis Rodriguez, and he asked me to do it. He asked me to attack him. He asked me to shoot him. So here, under cross-examination by the defense, this is when Kevin Perez talks a little bit more about being asked by Harrison to shoot Luis Rodriguez. Take a look. That's the defense grilling Kevin Perez in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. So Kevin Perez is a really interesting witness in this case about a reverend who's on trial for the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. Kevin Perez is talking about when he had conversations with the defendant about being asked to shoot the victim himself, and also when the defendant said that he was going to shoot the victim. And this back and forth about, do we believe Kevin Perez or do we not, becomes an interesting thing to analyze. I want to bring back in two of my guests right now. First, joining me via Skype is criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor David DiPietro, and joining me on set is criminal defense attorney Kenney Baden. First to you, David. I always find that interesting. If you're going to first say, so if you want to believe this and say, okay, I'm the Rev, I operate this drug trade, I have all my associates, Mr. Rodriguez is one of my drug associates, I got Mr. Perez, I got this guy Loudy, I got all these students. I first want them to take care of my dirty work by either attacking Mr. Perez. But then I'm going to do it myself. Something about that doesn't make sense to me. What do you think?
Yeah, it doesn't all tie in unless he's just talking big, and Harrison, and he basically wanted him to do it, and then just got so angry and enraged that he did it himself. Alternatively, the defense might be making the victim and all of the witnesses undesirable in the sense of some people that the jury can't sympathize with or understand. This is not somebody who got robbed at a bank or shot, who's an innocent person, that they're all intertwined in bad activity. Sort of hoping for a jury nullification based upon the fact that the jury just doesn't like anybody in the case. That might be an angle as well. But I think your point's well taken on whether this is actually something that's believable one way or another.
So Linda, here's my question to you. If you believe the prosecution, okay, and he's this mastermind, is the idea here, okay, if I can get a public display of attack, so if I can have one of the students, and we saw that, one of the students named Loudy, actually physically attack the victim in school. We saw the footage, knocked him, tackled him down. Then a few days later, or a short time after, Mr. Rodriguez is dead. He actually does get killed, okay? Couldn't the Reverend be in a perfect place to say, well, wait a second, I shot him? Me? You're having this high school student who is on camera attacking him. He's the one who killed him, or another student killed him. How could you say that I did? Because all you have is an order. So do you think that this was part of, if you believe the prosecution, this was part of a master plan so that no one would ever suspect him? So he could have shot Mr. Rodriguez himself, but by having these other events take place, it kind of secures him?
Well, you know, I'm grappling with this myself, Jesse, and you lay it out very well, because I do think that there's this whole aura around the Rev that he is a mastermind, that he does use these children for his advantage. And if he's using them for his advantage for one thing, he's going to use them for his advantage for another thing. So, yes, could he set them up? Yeah, in my mind, I believe that he could. I just don't know whether it's been proven. That's where I'm having the problem.
And you know what?
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. And you know what? At the end of the day, maybe he didn't do it. Maybe the person that they see on the footage, the camera footage of that shooting, maybe it's really not the Rev. Maybe these witnesses are not telling the truth. Maybe we just don't know. But maybe we'll find out a little bit more as this trial progresses. The jury's on a sight view. We're going to talk about that when we come back from the short break. Stay tuned. That was some earlier testimony in the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber. So Shaun Harrison is a reverend who's on trial for many different crimes, but really for the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. It's alleged that Mr. Harrison, Reverend Harrison, is actually leading a double life as a drug dealer, enlisted Rodriguez to help him in the drug trade. They got into a dispute, and he wanted him dead. So he shot him right in the back of the head, execution style, but Mr. Rodriguez survived. And he testified earlier in this case that Harrison's the one who shot him. Well, who did we just hear from? We heard from a man named Kevin Perez, another student at this high school, the English high school in Massachusetts. This high school is where Mr. Harrison was one of the deans and how he befriended some of these children. Now, according to the prosecution, Kevin Perez, who testified, said that he, too, was brought into this drug world by Mr. Harrison. And not only that, he asked him to shoot Luis Rodriguez. He tried to have him take the fall, in a way, and try to have him be the shooter. Now, that back and forth that you just heard between the defense attorney and Kevin Perez about what he initially said and what he's saying now about being asked to shoot Luis Rodriguez, Mr. Harrison saying that he was going to shoot Luis Rodriguez, those are crucial details. And sitting here from my perspective, and maybe from your perspective, and maybe even from the jury's perspective, it's not entirely clear what is happening. But let's try to break it down a little bit more. Joining me, I have two guests, as I said earlier in the program, two great guests. I have the criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor, David DiPietro, and joining me for the majority of this program so far has been criminal defense attorney Linda Kenney Baden. David, I'll start with you. Again, this back and forth about can we trust this young man? What did we just learn in that clip that we showed our viewers and listeners? Well, he wasn't entirely truthful with police. He also didn't remember when he ever initially told someone that Harrison was going to shoot Luis Rodriguez, or Harrison told him to shoot Luis Rodriguez. These are pretty big details that the jury's listening to. What did you make of it?
I mean, usually when somebody asks, for a normal person, when somebody asks somebody to shoot somebody, that raises fear. Maybe they should go to the police or report it to authorities or do something. And all these things really are making him, little by little, death by a thousand cuts, no pun intended, to really hurt his credibility as a witness. And like I mentioned earlier, I think what the defense is doing is making the individuals not being charged in this case less credible and less desirable and sympathetic for the jury to understand them and the way they live and their lifestyle.
Linda, I want to ask you this. The jury right now is on a sight view. So they're looking at the actual crime scene, the shooting. We talked about it earlier in the program. I just want to get your view again. So what do you think's happening right now with the jury taking this sight view?
Well, obviously they're seeing where the crime scene was, where the shooting scene was, whether it's remote, whether the people could see a shooting take place, whether you could even see the video cameras up there. Maybe the person that was doing the shooting didn't know there were video cameras up there. And that's what they're looking at. I don't know if it advances the credibility of any of the witnesses, it just may set a scene for this is where you shoot somebody if you want to attempt to kill them.
David, is it a way to say, hey, look, this is a pretty remote location. Maybe maybe you're there, you don't see the security cameras from the nearby gas station. Maybe, and when we show that footage, there was a lot of thick snow. It might be hard to see individuals that night. But what do you think?
Yeah, site visits are important. They're like the difference between reading a novel and then watching the movie. They're never quite the same, and we're, as humans, we're visual people, and especially more so than years past. And seeing is believing and understanding and conceptualizing. So important part of a case, and it's important. It usually helps the prosecution, generally speaking. But in this case, it might go either way.
Linda, final question to you, because I know we have to let you go. Yes. Does that make or break a case, a jury sight view, when juries get to see it themselves?
No, it doesn't. But it can add a little bit of a discussion period in the jurors' room. They may take something from the site visit and they may take it off as a talking point. But I don't think it makes or breaks the case unless there's an issue of whether you could actually see somebody who committed a crime and what the lighting is. And then that becomes very important.
And they're not allowed to, like, pretend to do shooting and run around. This is not a playground.
No, it's not.
Although we've seen some cases before where there's more latitude given to the jurors in those circumstances. So we'll have to wait and see. Linda Kenney Baden, thank you so much for joining us. It was great having you on. And now, David, I need you to stand by, okay, because I need you to stick around. There's a lot to talk about in this case. So, again, anybody just joining us, welcome. We're talking about the Reverend Shaun Harrison case, a Boston pastor who says, I'm not a drug dealer, I'm not a gang member, I'm simply the Rev. Well, the Rev is on trial right now for the attempted murder of a high school student. And those are some pretty serious charges, including gun charges and drug charges. As I say, it's something out of Breaking Bad, a reverend who's leading a double life, or allegedly leading a double life. We'll be right back.